So one of the questions that we want to start with, because this Lenten series, is what does the cross mean to you? So I just want you to take a moment to kind of reflect on that personally. When you think of the cross, what element of it is meaningful to you? Is it that Jesus died for our sins? Is it that Jesus went to the deepest, darkest, hardest place, which means that Jesus is with us in our deepest, darkest, hardest place? There's a lot of mystery of the cross. And I just want you to take maybe 30 seconds and reflect on what is most meaningful about it to you.
Yeah, for me, it's the death of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a symbol of hope.
Yes, the word that comes to me is salvation, which of course is, of course, well, that's what we hope for.
And forgiveness of sins.
And I always think of the resurrection as resurrecting us to conquering death.
Wow, I don't know what I'm feeling, because when I think of the cross, I think of how horrible. I think of the horror.
Diane, I had the same thought.
What men can do to a man.
Yeah.
I don't think of resurrection when I see the cross. I think of resurrection maybe when I think of the stone, but not the cross.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
I think the cross is the ultimate promise.
I think of love.
I do too. I think it's the greatest love.
We wear a cross to honor Jesus, but I think of the love that he gave his life for us. So
I think of it as a contrast, like the disconnection of humanity, of humans from God, to be able to do something like that. But at the same time, Jesus participating, following God's will.
Think of the global significance of the cross. I mean, just here in this Zoom room, there's a lot of different responses to it, but we all have a response, and that carries out into the whole world. There are people all around the world who have a response to it, and it has meaning.
For me, the cross symbolizes love, because God so loved the world, he sent his only son to come and die on that cross so that we may live free from sin.
For me, I think about the suffering associated with the cross and how the cross overcame everything but love, and ultimately love prevails.
I think of how he said it is finished, and it makes me think of completion of that love.
We bring with us such a rich tapestry of meaning of the cross. I really appreciate that in your answers, we had both the cross represents love and the cross represents terror. We'll often think of the paradox of the cross. We'll speak of it as a kind of terrible beauty, that this mysterious thing could kind of hold and encompass so much. So I am hoping that this study will add to kind of what you already hold, your theology of the cross. It's not meant to take away, it's meant to add kind of another layer through looking at the comparisons between the cross and the lynching tree. James Cone begins with this verse of scripture from Acts 10. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree. And I think that simple verse is enough to warrant a comparison between the cross and the lynching tree, at least kind of saying, there's some resemblance here that we want to look into and explore more deeply. And so today we're going to do a lot of history. We'll have more time for conversation in some of our classes as we go through week by week, but I'm going to share some history. ICU is going to share some history, and Philip is going to share some history. And what we don't get through today, we'll just pick up where we left off next week. I'm going to start with, yeah,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Could you share with us what you feel when you think of the cross?
Sure. I think as a person who regularly does funerals and sits with folks while they're dying, I think of even God was willing to go into the place of death to be with us. So that's maybe where I start. Thank you for asking. We're going to be exploring music a lot during this class because one of the great gifts of the Black church tradition is music. So I want to share this with you. What did you notice in that song or in the lyrics?
Lots of passion.
Mm-hmm.
Correlation of freedom.
He didn't have no freedom.
Mm-hmm.
See how that's maybe relating to the African American experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way they're telling the story of Jesus in the manger through their experience.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't it a pity and a shame? So wasn't it a pity and a shame? Like implying he didn't have, his humanity wasn't recognized.
Mm.
The words, they took him.
They took him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Ricky, I heard you say something about the blues.
Yes, you hear the blues in this, that life story that transitions, it's both spiritual and secular. There are similarities in the music and expression.
Yeah. It's interesting the way that you have this juxtaposition of these they're kind of telling this story as if, oh, this is a shame. This is a shame. And yet in the sound of the music, it's a kind of upbeat tune, right? You hear passion, as Bob said, you hear joy. So this music is being used to give hope and to inspire, even at the same time as it's sharing something in a kind of difficult way.
Can I add something about blues music, please? Just so those who are not musically inclined understand. Most music is written in what we call a 1, 4, and 5 chord. That's rock and roll, that's classical music from the 1700s. But blues is written in what some people would say in a chromatic scale. In other words, it's one half step after the other. There's 13 half steps in a scale. In regular music or music we like classical music, there's 8 notes in a scale with whole steps and not half steps. My point in mentioning this is in blues music, you're taking half steps at a time. You're going a little bit up or down the scale. You're not taking leaps of going from the first chord to the 4th chord, then to the 5th chord, and back to the 4th chord, which was like Elvis Presley music, was always written in 1, 4, and 5 chords. So blues is done in a chromatic way, which I think symbolizes a step-by-step process that some of the lyrics take to get the message across.
Wow. Thank you.
I love that. It's all about the transitions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's almost like Jesus didn't have freedom even from when he was born. He was born for a reason.
And don't you think he knew his destiny as a child?
That's what I mean. It wasn't like he was actually free. I just think of the little boy aspect of it. Maybe I'm just missing Simon. I don't know.
So this is how we do theology. This is how we read the Bible, is we go to the Bible with all of our life experiences, and the story looks to us the way it looks given all of our history and all that we've gone through. And there's going to be incredible power in African Americans, especially enslaved African Americans, looking at the story of Jesus and saying, hey, we recognize ourselves in his story. And that's very true in the cross, but I wanted to start here with the manger because we see it throughout the life of Jesus, not just on the cross. Feel good though. How do I? Okay. So we're gonna spend some time this morning with the history of lynching, because it's important to understand lynching if we're going to be making this comparison. So Brian Stevenson is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, who in the last couple of years built this really incredible lynching museum. I know some of you have been there, so we'll get a chance to hear from you. But he says, I am not interested in punishing America with this history. I want to liberate us. And I think that's a really helpful quote for us as we look at some of the really more difficult history in our nation's history, is to say we're not reviewing this out of some sense of guilt or punishment, but because the truth can set us free. And knowing the truth of the past can help us make wiser decisions in the future. So I just wanted to invite us to have that spirit of openness, that we're here to construct something together. One of Brian Stevenson's helpful quotes is, he says, slavery didn't end in 1865, it just evolved. So in the US, we had for 246 years a system of legal chattel slavery. And then following that, after the Civil War, we had a brief period of American history where federal laws did offer some protections for Blacks to become involved in politics, to vote, to sort of build communities. And that was a really important period of time, but it did not last very long. Starting in 1877 and for the next 80 or 90 years, we have what's called the Jim Crow era. So the Jim Crow era is a time of kind of forced discrimination, segregation. There are a lot of laws put into place. Also, we see the courts upholding laws that just sort of codify segregation into every facet of life. This is true especially in the South, but it's not just true in the South. This is also the era, the Jim Crow era, where we see the rise of mob violence and we have the terror of lynching. And then many scholars would say that, you know, this kind of evolution of slavery, the way we see play it out today, is in the quote war on drugs and mass incarceration of Blacks. So when you look at these years, 246 years of legal chattel slavery, 12 years where there's some protection, 88 years of Jim Crow, 50 years of the war on drugs and mass incarceration. This stuff is deeply entrenched in our history. You know, what this is trying to say is the second Civil War ended didn't mean that hearts and minds were changed. Although white Southerners lost the Civil War, they did not lose the cultural war. The struggle to define America as a white nation and Blacks as a subordinate race unfit for governing and therefore incapable of political and social equality, right? So he's saying, yeah, the Southerners may have lost the Civil War, but there is another war that they didn't lose, how we are defining America. There's an interesting piece of US history, if you're not familiar with it, in Wilmington, North Carolina. So shout out to Simon, who's in Wilmington right now. Wilmington was one of those areas when, after the Civil War, many Black Americans became very involved in politics. They built communities, they had a strong and flourishing life. And then essentially there was a coup, and white people became very uncomfortable with the presence of Blacks in the government, and there was a very violent coup. There was a massacre, and they were essentially evicted from their role in the government. So this is from the Wilmington Observer. There will be a meeting of the white men of Wilmington this morning at 11 o'clock at the courthouse. A full attendance is desired as business in the furtherance of white supremacy will be transacted. So yes, this is post-Civil War, but we see there's still huge problems. When we think of lynching, we often think of Jim Crow era lynchings against Black Americans, think about them at all. And we often think of the image of a noose, right, of a rope hung in a tree. But what lynching technically refers to is it's a kind of extra legal punishment sanctioned by the community. So lynching is not something necessarily that the government does or that the court does. It is a community saying, we want to enact some kind of justice or retribution on our own, so we're going to take matters into our own hands. It doesn't necessarily refer to the type of death. So, you know, someone could be killed by gun, and that could still be considered a lynching. Where did this phrase lynching come from? So there were two judges, they were brothers, Charles and William Lynch, and they used to punish Tory sympathizers during the American Revolution. Later, Judge Lynch was invoked by community members against perceived criminals. So lynching was not originally directed against African Americans. It was used for Tory sympathizers. And then, you know, as you think of the United States westward expansion, you have these kind of fledgling frontier communities, often maybe without strong governments. And so it's up to the community to kind of enact justice as they see fit. So they would kind of invoke the spirit of Judge Lynch and say, well, we're going to take matters into our own hands, and we're going to, you know, kill this person that we perceive to be a criminal. Lynching was often romanticized. So if you think of like Western movies and how they can romanticize a certain kind of retributive justice with guns and things like that, and it was sort of deemed a necessity, like this is something that we have to do against bad people. We're trying to understand the logic behind lynching, right? Like how, you know, to us it might seem, oh, this is so heinous. How did people do this? Well, we're trying to kind of get into the mindset and say, well, it was romanticized. It was seen as kind of the right thing to do against bad people. During the era of slavery, enslaved Blacks were considered too valuable as property to be lynched. You could beat or whip an enslaved person within an inch of their life, but ultimately, as someone who, quote, owned a slave, they were too valuable to you to kill them. There are a few exceptions. When somebody threatened the very system of slavery, they could be lynched. It was only after the Civil War that lynching became directed primarily against Black Americans. So I'm going to show an image of a lynching. I just want to warn you that. I'm going to show an image of a lynching, and I've taken care to choose a picture that does not show in any detail bodily harm to a person. Really what I want to show you is the crowds. So one of the really devastating things about lynchings in the South is that they were called spectacle lynchings. They were a form of entertainment. This is a whole crowd that is gathered to observe a lynching. So there were a number of reasons for doing this. There was kind of the idea that we're going to strike fear and terror into this population so that this doesn't happen to them. often as many as 10,000 to 20,000 men, women, and children attending the event. It was a family affair, a ritual celebration of white supremacy, where women and children were often given the first opportunity to torture Black victims. Postcards were made and sold to the crowds, who mailed them to friends and family. This could not have happened without widespread knowledge and the explicit sanction of local and state authorities, and with tacit approval from the federal government, members of the white media, churches, and universities. So again, we're talking about the role of community in these lynchings. You know, when you think of Jesus in his kind of legal proceedings before Pilate, you know, the crowd screaming, crucify him, that kind of mob sort of mentality. Lynchings took place after church. Sometimes they took place on church grounds. There's a really good bit of history that's been done about the lynchings in Montgomery County, Maryland, one of which took place right across the street from Poolesville Presbyterian Church. And it was written that they left the body until around 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, so that people going to church on Sunday morning would see the body. During this era, you have people lobbying our government to put into effect anti-lynching legislation. One such measure passed the House, but did not pass the Senate. And there was no accountability because your juries are made up of all white men, and they would almost never find a fellow white man guilty of lynching a Black man. So it's pretty heinous. Can I just, I'm gonna ask us to just take a moment of silence to just kind of take all of this in. I'm going to talk about the role of mob violence a little more. James Cone says, while white mob violence against African Americans was an obsession in the South, it was not limited to that region. White supremacy was and is an American reality. Whites lynched Blacks in nearly every state, including New York, Minnesota, and California. Wherever Blacks were present in significant numbers, the threat of being lynched was always real. Blacks had to watch their step no matter where they were in America. A Black man could be walking down the road, minding his business, and his life could suddenly change by meeting a white man who on a whim decided to have some fun. And I've put this photo here of Ahmaud Arbery. Of course, there's a lot we don't know about the case of Ahmaud Arbery. It hasn't gone to trial yet. But we do know is that the gentleman who shot Ahmaud Arbery did so saying they were trying to protect their neighborhood. So it's the definition of a lynching. It is community members acting outside the legal process to say we're going to take matters into our own hands. Richard Wright, who's the author of Native Son, I know I had to read that book in middle or high school. He wrote this, I had never in my life been abused by white, but I had already come as conditioned to their existence as though I had been the victim of 1,000 lynchings. So I think what he's kind of trying to express is that even if you had not personally suffered the abuse of white supremacy, or if you had not personally seen a lynching or known someone who was lynched, it was in the air. This sense of fear and terror was everywhere. James Cone, the author of our book, came to my alma mater, Duke Divinity, to give a talk in 2015. And the day that he arrived on campus, someone hung this noose in the tree. We also saw one at the US Capitol on January 6th. So these symbols are incredibly potent. incredibly harmful symbols because, they call to mind this whole heinous history. So again, we want to ask ourselves the question, how did this happen? As people of faith, we can look and say, this was done on church grounds. How in the world did this happen? And it always comes back to the stories that we tell. The stories that we tell about ourselves and others are incredibly powerful. And so there was storytelling or mythology that kind of propped up this behavior. So during the slavery era, you had this kind of image of the Black woman as a sort of caring mammy or auntie. After the Civil War, that image was changed to become a kind of salacious Jezebel, from a nurturing influence to a corrupting influence. You have these kind of stories, these cultural stories told that Black women are salacious. The same way you have a change in the image of a Black man, they are now seen by whites to have an insatiable lust for white women. Because of their threat to white womanhood, Black men must be carefully watched and violently kept in their place, segregated and subordinated. Even when sexual relations were consensual, race mixing was always translated to mean rape, and it was used as the primary justification of lynching. It was the moral and Christian responsibility of white men to protect the purity of their race by any means necessary. So this idea that a Black man has an insatiable lust for white women just plays an incredibly huge role in the continuation of this kind of terror, right? And it's a sort of fabricated myth. The claim that whites had the right to control the Black population through lynching and other extra-legal forms of mob violence was grounded in the religious belief that America is a white nation called by God to bear witness to the superiority of white over Black. Isa too is going to share with us a little bit about this film, but before she does that, I just want to kind of open up for any comments or responses.
Okay, I'll go first. I was able to read most of the first chapter right before we started meeting, and I'm still sick. Like, I am physically sick in my body right now. There's so much that I didn't learn growing up, and so much history that if I had been aware of it and understood it, I don't know. I just feel like it's almost hard to put into words. Anyway, I guess that's my point. It's sickening, and I'm really glad we're talking about it.
Thank you, Cheryl.
If I could add from a historical standpoint, some of you know me as a real big American Civil War history buff. I've got hundreds of books in my library on this subject. But what many people haven't learned, and what we're learning now through this book by James Cone, is what happened after 1865. When the war ended, our country just didn't reunite itself as one big happy family. Like somebody would have an argument with a family member, they'd hug and kiss the next day and say, "I'm so sorry," and everything's fine. It took years for the country to heal over the war. It's taking generations, actually. And the states were not admitted back to the Union right at the surrender of the Civil War. It took years for the states to be admitted back in the Union. And what occurred then was the states then had their own laws, their own jurisdiction, even though martial law was employed in states in the South trying to redirect law and order. It was just impossible for the remaining Union Army to control so much geography to what we would think would be right and moral, that things went the way of the white person. And these Confederate soldiers who returned home, especially the officers, were highly respected leaders in their communities. Despite the loss of the war, they were still highly respected. And they became the authority because they had fought for 4 years for a cause that they thought was right. And now they were going to find a new way to create to continue white supremacy. And then that became the development of the Ku Klux Klan. And this period of time, it took almost 20 years for the federal government to get control of these areas, to subdue what they could, but it still lasted for decades beyond.
I read here where the Birth of a Nation was received enthusiastically by President Woodrow Wilson. One thing that grabbed my attention when I watched The Birth of a Nation was that in the credits, it gives as the source for the historical background for the movie a book written by Woodrow Wilson.
Wow. So that's a helpful segue, Dave. I want to just check and see if your Zoom is working well enough that you could lead us through this slide. Do you want to introduce this film to us?
Yeah. So The Birth of a Nation debuted in 1905, and it was a film that reinforced and glorified stereotypes against African Americans, while also rendering lynching an honorable act of justice. It was first screened by President Woodrow Wilson at the White House. And by 1930, 90% of white Southerners had seen the film. And the film led to the rebirth of the KKK. And this is how they began burning the crosses. So in the clip we're about to show, it shows the violent stereotypes that was placed on African-American men, showing the character acting extremely lustful towards the white woman character, and putting that into perspective. It shows the KKK as the hero of the movie. So thinking 90% of white Southerners had seen the film, this is the media they're consuming that, reinforced racism. So yeah.
Thank you. So in this clip that we're going to show, there's a young woman who's going to go out to collect some water. And many of the African Americans in this film are actually played by white actors in blackface. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. What happens in the rest of this scene is that she ends up essentially jumping off a cliff to try and escape this man, and her father kind of comes out as the sort of savior figure to try and save her. Stu, is there anything else you want to add about that?
I mean, the only thing you can really say is like this, because, you know, it's reinforcing the same bad stereotypes, and just even seeing how it was kind of dehumanizing because they couldn't even have actual Black actors in the film. So, yeah.
What we're trying to kind of get at is to understand the narratives, the stories about others and ourselves that would lead to something like lynching. I'm going to turn it over now to Philip to talk to us about sort of African American response.
Okay, so my part, I'm going to talk about basically the very last part of the book, which goes into a lot about the Black church. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Okay. So the last part of chapter 1 talks a lot about music and the Black church. And so on page 12, there's a quote that says, "How did Southern rural Blacks survive the terror of this era?" The era that Dr. Cohn was talking about is basically the lynching era, which was between 1880 and 1940 is what the lynching era is. And so Black people during this time were really able to go out and like protest and really stand up for themselves because of the fear of being lynched. So the only form of resistance that Black people had during this time were at the juke joints on Friday and Saturday night, and at churches on Sunday mornings and midweek. And those were the only times where Black people were able to affirm who they were as human beings. So, the next slide. Can you go to the next slide? Okay. So the one before that one. There it is. So Black people found hope in music. There was some talk about the blues and all that. And so here are some images that I found from the internet. These are actual images of Black people dancing and enjoying each other, joining the company. This is the only time where they felt like they could be themselves. On page 16 of chapter 1, it says, Blacks enjoyed Friday and Saturday night so much that they forgot only for a few hours whatever humiliations they endured throughout the week. So during this time, they could have been humiliated, talked about, spat upon, and called all kinds of names, Sunday through Thursday. But on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, when they gathered in these juke joints in churches, they totally forgot about themselves, and they danced and they laughed and they talked. And in chapter 1, it talks about how even some of the songs that were sung in these juke joints, they were able to really express themselves. They were really, Black people were able to really say what was on their heart, things they couldn't say to a white person in their face. They could express it and say it in these juke joints on Friday and Saturday night. The next slide. So the importance of the Black church during the lynching era. Tasha Bonnie mentioned Richard Wright at the beginning of her part. And Dr. Cohn talks a lot about Richard Wright all through chapter 1 and in the introduction. And he was a famous African American novelist who wrote tons of books. And one of the quotes that I really like from chapter 1, it says, "Our churches are where we dipped our tired bodies in cool springs of hope, where we retained our wholeness and humanity despite the blows of death." On Sunday morning at church, Black Christians spoke back in song, sermon, and prayer against the faceless, merciless, apocalyptic vengeance of the mass white mob. determine our final meaning. So the Black church, even the Black church today, the Black church during this time was so important for Black people. Even today, like the Black church is a place where where Black people can be themselves. The Black church is a place where not just spiritual needs were met, but social needs were met as well. And all that was found in the church during this time period and even in 2021. So the next slide. So again, the Black church being these cool springs of hope. So I took it upon myself to find some historic Black churches. Some of these you may know of, some of you may not know of. Two of these churches I've had the opportunity to actually worship in, Metropolitan AME in DC and the one in Birmingham where the bombing took place in the 60s. Are two churches that I've actually had the opportunity to worship in. And then of course there's Asbury United Methodist in DC and Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina, where Dylan Ruth went in and shot and killed 9 people doing worship. It's not in the book, but just as a point of reference, the Black church for many people, like I said before, was a point of social contact, was a point where people can go to be themselves. In most communities of color, mostly Black communities, the church is all that they had. Even in like some of the most poorest communities, neighborhoods, the church was the center point of the community. People would give like their last dime to make sure that the church continued on, make sure that the church keep its lights on, make sure the church was built. And so some of these are some churches I thought were really important for history and everything. But these churches are still up and running. They're still pillars of the community, if you will. Still those springs of hope that Black people cling to in times of despair. So the next slide. So God's presence, Black existence. There's a quote on page 18 and 19 that says, "It is only when we are within the walls of our churches that we can wholly be ourselves, that we keep alive a sense of our personalities in relation to the whole world we live in, that we maintain a quiet and constant communion with all that is deepest within us. Going to church on Sundays is like placing an ear to another's chest to hear the unquenchable murmur of the human heart." And if you've ever been to a Black church, it's exactly like it is in the picture here. It's exuberant and it's loud and it's celebrative, and it's an amazing experience. Again, where within those walls, like people can freely be themselves wholly. Growing up, I grew up in the Black church. I'm a part of the Black church, and I remember when we went to church, it was a place where we were at all the time, like Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, weekly revivals that we had. Like we were always at church, and it was like this in this picture, just exciting and exuberant, and a place where you could be yourself, and not just yourself, but really feel God's presence and be around other like-minded people who look like you. Next slide. I'm going to go play the video first, and then we'll talk about it.
When I get up in the morning, I must say, Jesus, Lord, keep me. Yeah. I've got to be right near the cross.
Jesus keep me near the cross. Um, in the book, Dr. Cohn talks about this paradox, if you will, this contradiction between the cross. And so I can't read that. Hold on a second. So anyway, Dr. Cohn talks about this paradox, if you will, between uh, the cross and what the cross meant for Black people. And so uh, for Black people, they saw themselves on the cross, if you will. When they saw Jesus on the cross, they basically saw themselves. Um, the book talks about this re-crucified Christ. And so for many Black Christians, um, when they see Jesus on the cross, they saw themselves. And so on page 23, it said Black people stretched their hands to God because they had nowhere else to turn. Because of their experience of arbitrary violence, the cross was and is a redeeming and comforting image for many Black Christians. If the God of Jesus' cross is found among the least, the crucified people of the world, then God is also found among those lynched in American cases. So again, for Black Christians, they sought comfort in the cross, but also they could see themselves in Jesus being on the cross as well. And so um, so again, this whole idea of the least, they saw themselves in that. So the next slide.
Sorry.
Love that song. So again, identifying with a crucified Jesus. And so this picture here is kind of fuzzy on my end, but if you can see it on your end, this is the stained glass at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And I visited this church about 2 years ago. And it's an image, it's how they depict Jesus being on the cross. And so in the mystery of God's revelation, Black Christians believe that just knowing that Jesus went through an experience of suffering in a manner similar to theirs gave them faith that God was with them, even in suffering on lynching trees, just as God was present with Jesus in the suffering on the cross. So again, so when Black people saw in the suffering of Jesus being on the cross, Black people saw themselves in that suffering as well. And so for Black people during the lynching time, even Black Christians now, this whole idea of the cross is not a beautiful thing. It's a thing of suffering, if you will, for most Black Christians, even myself. I see the cross as a symbol of suffering, but also in the cross, I see myself as a Black man, as Jesus was also. But the cross speaks to an oppressed people in ways that Jesus' life, teachings, and resurrection did not. So when we talk about the resurrection, a lot of Black people did see themselves in the resurrection, but they saw themselves on the cross. So the cross places God in the midst of crucified people, in the midst of people who are hung, shot, buried, and tortured. So again, this whole idea of the cross, Black people saw themselves in Jesus' crucifixion and not so much Jesus' resurrection. And so I believe that's my portion of this lesson. Yeah.
Thank you, Philip. And I thank you all for a bit of extra time today. We're going to close with just one last piece of music. This was the title of his chapter, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen. So let's listen to this together, and let's let this kind of serve as a closing prayer. And I just hope that as you listen to this, maybe you're familiar with this song. Maybe you'll hear more in this song than you've heard before.
No.
So I want to thank you for your time today and for just having the grace and spaciousness to hold this. I'm going to offer you a blessing. And if you want, and I'll stick around for another 10 minutes if anyone wants to stick around and respond. Steve, you're holding up the book. Is there something you want to say? No, okay. I'm going to offer a blessing and I'll stick around. And if you have any reflections or questions you want to ask, you're welcome to do that. I'm hoping our future classes will be a little more interactive. We just had a lot of history to cover today, as you often do on a first day. So may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up her countenance upon you and give you peace. Go forth trusting in the love of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Live in peace and in joy. Amen.